Now we'll cover the last of the verbal operants, duplics and codics. Here are the objectives for this module. As always, per the objectives near the bottom of the list, be prepared to define each verbal operant, give examples of the operants, and identify the operant represented by different examples. As with the term sequelic, Skinner did not use the terms codic and duplic in his book Verbal Behavior. Jack Michael coined these terms in a paper published in 1982, part of the assigned reading this week. In fact, Skinner's writing on this topic is not even assigned because we talk about these terms so differently now. Taking dictation and transcription are synonymous. They are a type of codic. Copying a text is a completely different behavior, a type of duplic. We'll get into all the different types of codics and duplics momentarily, but just bear in mind that their definitions are based on the point-to-point correspondence and formal similarity between the response and the controlling verbal SD. If you recall, the term intraverbal can now be used to refer to all verbal behavior under the control of verbal stimuli. A sequelic is a type of intraverbal, but it's also often simply called an intraverbal. Sequelic intraverbals do not have point-to-point correspondence with their controlling SDs. If a response does have point-to-point correspondence with the SD, it's a codic. If it also has formal similarity, it's a duplic. Then we get down to the general topography of the SD and the behavior. This is how we classify the type of codic or duplic. For example, if the antecedent is vocal and so is the behavior, the type of duplic would be echoic. Before we get to formal similarity, do you remember the definition of point-to-point correspondence? In order to have formal similarity, the antecedent and behavior must also have point-to-point correspondence. The first component of the stimulus matches the first component of the response, the second matches the second, etc., and the stimulus and the response products are in the same general topography. Remember, though, that an antecedent and behavior can have point-to-point correspondence without having formal similarity. And again, to clarify, an antecedent and response can both be written, but if they don't have point-to-point correspondence, they don't have formal similarity. So now we come to the definitions of the operants. Duplics are verbal operants controlled by verbal stimuli, and there is point-to-point correspondence and formal similarity between the stimulus and response. Codics are similar, but the stimulus and response have only point-to-point correspondence, not formal similarity. And finally, from last week, sequelic intraverbals have no point-to-point correspondence with their controlling verbal stimuli. As with all operants except for the mand, these are maintained by socially mediated generalized conditioned reinforcement. So again, what's the definition of a duplic? Here's a hint. Think of the duplic response as one that duplicates the verbal stimulus that preceded it. The different types of duplics are echoics, imitation, and copying text. Echoic behavior produces the same sounds as the controlling stimulus in the same order. Imitation is a gesture or physical movement that matches the verbal gesture or physical movement that preceded it. And of course, copying text is exactly what it sounds like. It produces the same written or printed letters or words in the same order as the verbal stimulus. What type of duplic is this? And this? It's important to note that imitation of nonverbal behavior is typically not verbal. For example, when you teach simple motor imitation, it is not the verbal type of imitation. Your model of the motor response is not verbal behavior and does not produce verbal stimuli. While Skinner's text is not assigned this week, there are a few points he made about echoic behavior in particular that must be included here. For example, by his conceptualization, if the stimulus and response do not match exactly, as in the case of someone with a lisp, it is still considered echoic behavior. Skinner also noted some types of behavior that may look a bit like echoic behavior but do not qualify. First, echoic behavior does not include responses which are maintained by automatic reinforcement. Always go back to the definition of verbal behavior when determining whether a response is a verbal operant in the first place. Some examples of responses that are not verbal behavior include vocal play, such as making funny sounds or humming to yourself, and auto-shaping, the development of a very young child's vocal behavior automatically reinforced by how closely it matches other vocal sounds in the environment. Of course, these vocal responses are often quickly socially reinforced, allowing for the establishment of a verbal repertoire. Another non-example of echoic behavior is the much later reproduction of overheard speech. For example, you hear a funny joke. Then, when hanging out with a friend the next week, you tell them that joke. What kind of verbal operant do you think that would be? It wouldn't be echoic, since the primary control is not being exerted by an immediately preceding vocal stimulus. A final non-example is vocal imitation of non-verbal auditory stimuli. For example, imitating a dog barking or the sound of a train whistle. Since the stimulus is non-verbal, it cannot be an echoic or any type of intraverbal. So, what operant might it be classified as? We've talked about why mands, tacts, and sequelics are likely to be reinforced. Why do you think that duplics might be reinforced? That is, why would a listener reinforce the speaker's echoic or copying text behavior? Here are some examples. If you engage in echoic behavior, repeating what someone just said in a conversation, such that a third person in the conversation can hear it better and then respond, the behavior is reinforced with the continuation of that conversation. Similarly, if you repeat something back to someone who just spoke to you, that allows them to confirm that you heard correctly, or not. Suppose you hear instructions on a plane to buckle up and put away your laptop. If you repeat those instructions to the person sitting beside you, the increased salience of the instructions may make it more likely that they'll obey. You can also repeat yourself multiple times. This is discussed way back in Module 3 with regards to the dynamic properties of the mand. You can certainly see how verbal behaviors can serve multiple functions simultaneously. Here we see an SD, a response, and the maintaining reinforcement. Is this an example of an echoic, imitation, copying text, or is it not a duplicate in the first place? Same question. Is this an example of an echoic, imitation, copying text, or is it not a duplicate in the first place? And here? What if someone says NLU and another person says back NLU, maintained by the first person saying yeah? And if I fingerspell ABC, occasioning the behavior of someone writing ABC, what's that an example of? How about this example? You hear someone snoring. And you say, he's snoring. The response is, he sure is. What type of verbal operant might this be? Based on review of the duplicate, what do you think is the definition of codic behavior? As with all intraverbals, codics can be occasioned by any type of verbal stimulus. Textual responses are vocal and may be occasioned by visual, i.e. written, or tactile, i.e. braille, stimuli. These are just examples. Hieroglyphs, symbols of a phonetic alphabet, pictographs, anything visual or tactile goes. Skinner defined textual behavior rather simply as a vocal response under the control of a non-auditory verbal stimulus on page 66. He also noted that a speaker under the control of a text is, of course, a reader on page 65. However, reading often has more complex implications, such as comprehension. Textual behavior is much narrower. Note that these definitions focus entirely on vocal behavior. Perhaps we could make our own update and include gestural behavior as well. When in doubt, though, just keep in mind that any verbal response occasioned by a verbal stimulus with which it has point-to-point correspondence is a codic. On to transcription and taking dictation. In this case, the verbal stimulus is auditory, you hear it, and the response is written, you write down what you hear. I again propose that this could include cases of the stimulus being gestural and the response being written, but one of us will just need to find the time and write a paper about it. Overall, there are many learning channels that are not accounted for by these two terms. For example, what about a stimulus being fingerspelled in American Sign Language, occasioning a vocal response with point-to-point correspondence? That's clearly a codic, but can't be easily identified as textual or transcription. What might be some cases in which codic behaviors are reinforced? Let's consider some common topographies and learning channels. How about writing down what someone says out loud, such as in class? The notes can be studied later. We also have reading out loud. In what cases might that be reinforced? How about reading to yourself? Remember, the speaker or reader can act as their own listener, even when the behavior is covert. The behavior was established and shaped by a verbal community and is ultimately maintained by socially mediated reinforcement, so it does still qualify as verbal. Skinner wrote that, indeed, textual behavior is so strongly reinforced that one is likely to find oneself reading not only letters, books, and newspapers, but unimportant labels on packages, subway advertisements, and billboards. It's amazing how much we read when you start paying attention to it. Some of the examples we reviewed earlier were in fact codics, not duplics. If I fingerspell NLU and someone vocally responds NLU, that's a codic. But it can't be clearly identified as textual or transcriptive behavior. Here is another codic that doesn't have a clear classification. So, what is an example of textual behavior? Be sure to note the controlling antecedent and the response. How about transcription? We'll practice with many more examples in class.